So there's a few good reasons to support OAuth as part of your Plaid connection flow. For one thing, your connection will be a lot more stable and resilient. For another, it can often be a better user experience. And finally, starting this year, it's mandatory. Probably should have just led with that first one. Anyway, getting OAuth implemented correctly does involve a little bit of work, but honestly, it's not too bad. So why don't you follow along with me and we'll get it done together on this episode of Plaid Academy. Okay, so for the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume you already know how to talk to the Plaid API. Like you already have an account set up over at the Plaid dashboard, you know how to initialize the link widget, and you've been able to successfully generate an access token so that you can talk to the Plaid APIs, at least in the sandbox environment. If you haven't done any of those steps or you just need a refresher, why don't you go ahead and check out our quick start video and then come back to this one. It's okay, you can pause this, I won't be offended. So here's our plan for today. First, I'll give you a somewhat overly simplified explanation of how OAuth works, because frankly, once you have a better idea of what the OAuth flow looks like, our code will make a lot more sense. Then we'll look into adding OAuth into our own sample application. I'll be doing this with vanilla JavaScript, which hopefully you can then adapt into React or Vue or whatever JavaScript framework you happen to be using. Okay, so let's start by taking a moment to understand how OAuth works. And before we do that, let's remind ourselves of what happens right now when a user connects your app to their bank using Plaid. First off, your application will ask Plaid for a link token. This token is used to help verify the client that's talking to Plaid, but it can also carry some information around how to actually perform the link flow. That's some important foreshadowing that I will get to later. Your client then initializes the link widget, and your user signs into their bank through Plaid. Plaid then returns a public token, which your client can then send to your server, which sends it off to Plaid, in exchange for an access token, which your server can then use to talk to the Plaid service on behalf of your user. With me so far? Again, if any of this is unfamiliar, check out the quick start video where I go over all of this in much more detail. So let's go back to this step here where a user signs into their bank through Plaid. In many cases, depending on the bank's level of sophistication, your user is simply sending over their credentials, which we use to access this bank in the future. And while that can work, Plaid, along with many banks out there, is moving to a world that's a lot more API-driven. In this scenario, banks have their own REST servers with endpoints that Plaid can talk to on behalf of your application. And in much the same way you have an access token that you can use to talk to Plaid on behalf of your user, Plaid has its own access token that it can use to talk to these financial institutions. But how do we get those tokens? Well, that's where OAuth comes in. OAuth allows users to give Plaid, and by extension your application, access to their financial data without having to share their username or password. So the full OAuth flow with Plaid is a little complex. So maybe before we get into that, let's imagine a slightly simpler scenario first, one that's more typical when a user signs in using OAuth. The way it would work is at this point here, instead of showing any kind of dialogue where you ask your user to enter their username and password, your app could redirect the user directly to their bank. You might say something like, hey, this is app ABC, and we want permission to view this user's transaction history. Please ask the user to give us access and then send them back to this page here. This address that you're giving them, by the way, is known as a redirect URL or URI, and you will hear this term a lot. The bank will then ask their user to sign in, if they're not already, and then ask them to grant you permission to view their data. Assuming your user says yes, the bank will redirect them back to the redirect URL that you provided, and attached to this URL will be a one-time password, sometimes called an auth code. Your app can then take that code and exchange it for an access token. The specifics here depend a bit on the implementation. Often you might do this through like a server-to-server call, passing along a secret key alongside that code. And that means that in the future, if we need to talk to your customer's bank, we can do that by directly communicating with some REST endpoints that they have set up using this OAuth access token as proof that the user has granted us access to that data. And the nice thing here is the bank has the flexibility to treat this access token differently than, say a username and password. They could provide different two-factor auth logic, for instance, so that a user doesn't get, unexpected text messages. They could grant these tokens more restrictive permissions, like being able to read data but not make changes to it. They also allow a user to easily revoke permissions to one app while leaving others intact. And if the user changes their password, access tokens are usually unaffected. So you might notice a couple of things here. First is that this bank had to do a lot of work up front to support this. Like, this bank has to not only support this entire OAuth flow, but it also has to have an entire REST service set up where it's able to receive these kinds of calls and verify access tokens and so on. That's a pretty big chunk of work for a lot of these banks, particularly smaller community ones. So this means that while many major banks in the US and nearly all of them in Europe support this system, many smaller ones do not. But the second thing you might notice is that you would have to do quite a bit of work to establish yourself with this bank first, right? Like, this bank probably needs to know who you are and have the appropriate names and logos to show your customer. You'd also need to clear that redirect URL with them in advance so that they know it's a legitimate one to send that code back to. That is a common and important security practice. And most likely there might be some due diligence involved here, where these banks will want to make sure you're a legitimate organization, you have easy ways for users to control their data, and so on. And, these banks aren't necessarily developer platforms. They don't all have easy to access portals where you can just apply for an OAuth account or update redirect URLs right away, at least not that I've been able to find, but maybe I'm not looking hard enough. And you would need to do that with every bank that creates their own OAuth service. And I'm guessing most of you didn't get into this business because you enjoy filling out multiple registration forms. Okay, get out of here. You're messing up my pretty slides. But who does have a good relationship with these banks, has established themselves as a reputable partner, and has redirect URIs set up with all these institutions? That's right, Plaid. So in practice, what actually happens is that Plaid inserts itself as like a little stepping stone in this OAuth process. So instead of your app redirecting directly to a bank, your app is going to redirect to a page hosted by Plaid. Plaid will then go through this OAuth flow that I described earlier. We'll redirect your user to this bank, they can grant us permission to access their data, and then the bank redirects them back to a redirect URI that's once again hosted by Plaid. And from there, we can grab the one-time code passed along from the bank and exchange that for an access token that the Plaid service can use to talk to this bank in the future. And, if you think about it, this kind of makes more sense anyway. It's not your app server that's talking to these banks, it's Plaid that's doing it on behalf of your application. But we do still need to finish up with your app. So at this point, we basically kind of perform our own mini OAuth flow. We redirect the user back to your app, passing along our own one-time password. Your app will then send that password along to Plaid, and once we've verified that you are who you say you are, we can send you back a public token so that you can complete the standard connection process. Oh, and I should probably point out, these redirects from Plaid happen so fast that you probably won't notice them unless you're really looking for them. As far as your users are concerned, this just looks like a standard OAuth flow. But this means that instead of trying to establish relationships with every bank out there, you just need to sign up with Plaid. And as it so happens, we do have an easy-to-access portal where you can do things like supply your name and logo, update a list of valid redirect URIs, and so forth. So with that general explanation under our belt, let's start building out our own client app to support our user signing in through OAuth. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get a sample app running that's using a basic non-OAuth version of Link. Once we've done that, we'll make some changes to support the OAuth flow. Now, as you know, any Plaid application needs both a client and a server set up to run. Our sample app will be using just vanilla JavaScript on the client, so you should be set up there as long as you've got yourself a web browser. But on the server, we're going to be using NodeJS. Now, I'm currently on Node 16.14.0, the latest LTS version at the time of this recording, and you should probably be on something similar if you want to follow along. And I do recommend following along with me if you can. Not only will it be a good learning experience, but you'll have some nice code that you can copy and paste from in the future. So make sure you've got Node set up, and let's start coding. So first, we're going to start by grabbing the Plaid tutorial resources repo. I'm getting it here from github.com/plaid/tutorial-resources, but this link should also be available in the description below. So let's just git clone it into here. And then I'm going to jump into this folder and head on over to the vanilla.js OAuth directory, and then from there go into start. Now, this app is based on the other quick start apps we have. So if you've used either our quick start or tiny quick start in the past, this structure should feel at least somewhat familiar to you. So first things first, I'm going to copy over .env example to .env and then start up VS Code. I am going to add in my client ID and client secret to the env file from the Plaid dashboard, and I'm going to be sticking to the sandbox environment. Next, I will open up a terminal window and call npm install, and then I'll run npm start, and we've got our server running on port 8000. And if you want to check it out, it should look something like this. I'm going to click on this link to connect to our bank. Then we can click that big blue button. and go through the link sign-in process. And once we're done, we're redirected back to our front page. And now we've got this big button here where we can retrieve some transaction information. So let me click on it and it spits out a bunch of JSON to the screen. Ooh, look at all that data. So let's take a quick tour of the code here. I'm not going to spend too much time on the server since most of our work is on the client, but just real quick, I've got an Express server set up running in Node.js. Probably the most interesting thing to note here is that I'm using some session storage to store and retrieve the user's access token. This is like a little key value store on the server where we can store data based off of a session cookie. And you can see down here is where we set it to, keep our access token once we get it. Obviously, in a real application, we'd be storing this in a database and like keying it off of the user's user ID. But, this gives us a reasonable approximation to that with much less code. Good enough for demo purposes. And then you can see up here, we're setting up the Plaid client library. Here's a call to determine if our user has already connected to a bank by looking to see if they have an access token. See here again, we're getting it from our session storage. Here's a fun little function to get the name of the bank we're connected to. So fun. Here's one to create a link token, one to exchange a public token for an access token, and then one to retrieve some recent transactions. And that is our server code. So let's move on to the client, which is stored here in our public directory. We'll start with our front page here. Basically, it's a simple HTML file. I'm loading in some Tailwind CSS for some basic styling up here. And then you can see I have a disconnected UI div to show when our user is not connected to a bank, and a connected one to show when they are, and they are both hidden at the moment. So here in our index.js file, I make a call to see if our user is connected to a bank yet. If they are, I will show this connected UI. And then I call this function here, which loads up the name of our bank and displays it to our user. The connect UI also has a get transactions button. And you can see here, I've connected this up to our get transactions function. This basically grabs our transactions from the server, simplifies the data somewhat, and then prints out that JSON both to the console and to our page. Now, if our user isn't connected, then we just show our disconnected UI. This really just contains a link that takes them to our connect.html page. So let's open that one next. And there's not much here besides a semi-transparent button and the script here where we are loading Plaid link. That's the widget that helps the user connect with their bank. So let's take a look at the code for this page. When the page first loads, we'll run initialize link. This calls create link token on the server, which fetches a link from Plaid and returns it to our page. Once that happens, we store the link token object into our variable up here and make our button look a lot more clickable. When the user clicks the button, we can call start link. This in turn calls Plaid create with an object that has 4 important properties. First is the link token. I'm going to grab the link token property from that link token object that we got back from our server. We've got an on event and on exit function that really just logs some stuff to the console right now. And then an on success function whose main purpose is to call exchange token. And then exchange token is a function that takes the public token we get back from link and sends it down to our server so our server can exchange it for a real access token. Assuming all that goes well, we can then redirect folks back to our index page, which should now properly show our connected UI so our user can grab a list of recent transactions. So this should all seem fairly familiar and hopefully nothing you haven't seen before. Again, if any of this seems kind of weird and strange to you, check out the quick start tutorial first. Now at this point, we haven't really done anything OAuth related, right? Like this is a pretty standard connect with Plaid kind of flow. But here's the thing, even though you haven't done anything special, OAuth kind of sort of already works. Here, let me show you. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask to connect to a new bank. Then I'm going to start up link and I'm going to type OAuth up here. And that'll let me select Platypus OAuth Bank. This is a bank where we pretend like your app is already set up to use them as an OAuth partner, and therefore we should activate the OAuth flow. Because watch what happens when we ask to connect with them as a bank. We basically get a pop-up window where you can sign in and validate your app through this bank's website. I'll sign in with usergood and passgood. I'll select 1234 as my 2-factor auth code. I'll pick a couple of accounts, grant my application access to certain bits of data. I will agree to the terms of service, always the most exciting part of any demo. And when I'm done, I have a public token in my code, which I exchange for an access token, which brings me back to my welcome screen, where I'm once again able to access my data, but this time from the Platypus OAuth Bank. So, wow, we have OAuth already working in a pop-up window, which leads to a very important question. Are we done? And the answer is no. As you can see in our timeline, we still have several minutes left in our video, so clearly there's more to do here. The issue is that while this pop-up version works pretty well on a desktop browser, there are definitely times when it won't work as well, and almost all those times are on mobile devices. For starters, in certain situations on mobile, like if you're showing this sign-in screen as like part of a web view embedded in a mobile app, the pop-up flow just won't work, it'll seem broken. And for another, our data has shown that users are less likely to complete this flow on mobile devices when you use a pop-up window. I think part of this is just because navigating between different windows on a mobile browser is just a little more awkward. But more importantly, if you rely on a pop-up window instead of redirecting to another site, you miss the opportunity of switching to the bank's native app. And for a lot of these apps, the user's already signed in or can sign in through something like Face ID, where the experience is just a lot better than trying to enter your password on your phone's keyboard. But you can only do that if you redirect the user to the website instead of using a pop-up. Or more specifically, if you redirect the user to Plaid, then to the bank, then back to Plaid, then back to your app, right? Remember this thing? Yeah, like that. And so that's what we're going to do next. Luckily, the link widget takes care of most of this work for us, so let's give it a try. So the first thing we need to do here is make sure we have a redirect URI to pass along to Plaid. That is a URL that's part of our website for Plaid to send our user back to after they finish the OAuth flow. I know in a lot of examples out there, you'll see these apps use the same page as both the page that initiates the whole connection as well as the page to return to. And I know there are some good reasons for doing that, but I think it's actually quite a bit easier to understand what's going on if we make these separate pages. So here's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to create a new page that I'll call, let's say OAuthReturn.html. I'll leave this mostly empty for now. We'll get back to this in a bit. Next, we need to tell Plaid Link about this redirect URL. And this is something that's actually done server-side when we request that link token to send up to our client. Remember that foreshadowing bit when I told you that the link token can affect how link behaves? Well, this is that bit. So what I'm going to do is open up our server.js file and go find this create link token function. And in this object that gets passed into our Node client library, I'm going to add another property. It's called redirect URI, and I will set it to this OAuth return page. And I loaded it up here, so let me just copy and paste the URL just to make sure I get it right. All right, lovely. Note that I'm using HTTP here, which is, fine in the sandbox environment, but I will need to upgrade to HTTPS before accessing any real data. So next time I request a link token, my server will read in this redirect URI and include it as part of the data associated with that token. Now, when Link is given this token and is asked to connect to a bank that supports OAuth, it'll say, well, I see I have a redirect URI, so I'm going to use the redirect flow instead of a pop-up window. So let's try this. I'm going to restart our server so it picks up this change. Then let me go back to our index page here. Now we no longer have an access token since our session has restarted, so I'll ask to connect to our bank. And wow, well, we have crashed our server. That's pretty impressive. Let's find out why. Okay, so this error message is telling us two things. First, I should probably put my code in a try-catch block so, my server doesn't crash when there's an error. That'd be nice. But second, that this URL that we've specified as a redirect URI isn't one that Plaid has in its records. Remember, Plaid, like any good OAuth provider, will only redirect back to a URL that we've supplied to it ahead of time. It's a good security measure to make it harder for bad guys to intercept these codes. Luckily, this is a pretty easy fix. I'm going to go over to our developer dashboard at dashboard.plaid.com. And you might think I would select OAuth here, but I'm not. I'm going to select API. Then I'll click on this configure link next to allowed redirect URIs. I'll click add new URI and add in this new page. Now this does have to match exactly with what you specify in your link token. And I've had plenty of cases where I thought these two strings matched exactly and they didn't. So just to be safe, I'm going to copy and paste it directly from my code. So I will hit save changes, verify my password, and now let's give this one more try. So let me start up my server again. I'll go back and reload this page, and now I can connect to my bank. Once again, I'll type in OAuth and select Platypus OAuth. I don't know the difference between these two, but I'll try and figure it out and put it in the comments sometime later. And I'll hit continue. And you can see that instead of popping things up in another window, this is redirecting my current browser window to Platypus Bank. So let me complete the sign-in flow. And when I'm done, Plaid redirects me back to my OAuth return page. And this thing up here, the OAuth state ID, is basically the one-time password that I now need to send back to Plaid so it can finish up the link process and give me my public token. Well, how do we do that? The same way our clients typically talk to Plaid, by using the link widget. So let's open up OAuth return.html. And let's see, first I'm going to copy over this link initialize script so that link is loaded onto my page. And then let's load up an OAuth return script. So let's create that file. Hey, fun trick, if you command click on this link in VS Code, it'll say, hey, I can't find this file. You want me to create it for you? And I will say, yes, that would be lovely. And then let's see here. Let's create a function called finish OAuth, where we take this URL with the code and send it over to Plaid. And so we can do that by opening link one more time. The only difference is now we're passing along this incoming URL with that OAuth state ID so that Plaid knows we are finishing up an OAuth flow. So in fact, I can just get started by copying and pasting the plaid.create call from my connect.js page. Really, the only thing I need to do here differently is I'm going to add this new property received redirect URI, where I can pass in window.location.href. And then once again, you can see down here, we're calling handler.open. Now, there are two obvious bugs here. First is that this exchange token function doesn't exist. So I guess let's copy and paste this function too. Yeah, I know all this duplicate code is really bad form. Here, you know what? Let's fix it real quick. There, perfect. I don't know about you, but I feel better already. The other issue is that I need to pass along a link token. But here's the thing, as an additional security measure to make sure this one-time code has really reached its intended recipient, this has to be the same link token as we passed in before. Generating a new one doesn't work. So how can we do that? We need to find a way of saving this token between the time our user leaves our site and they come back, and well, copying and pasting from my server logs here ain't gonna cut it. Now, there's a few ways of doing this. One way might be to send this to our server and store it in a database associated with this user ID. Perfectly reasonable solution, but that would involve my sample app having some kind of sign-in solution so I can get a user ID as well as a database, and it currently has neither. Another option might be to use a cookie. Cookies are still fine, but I think I might go with local storage. Basically, local storage is a client-side method that gives you a way to store key value pairs using JavaScript so you can retrieve them later. It has a similar method called session storage, but I believe there might be a few edge cases where local storage works better, so that's what I'm going to stick with. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to go back to connect.js, and up here, when I get back my link data, I will store it like this. We'll set item link data equal to, and this has to be a string, so we will JSON stringify this link token data. Then in my OAuth return code, I will retrieve that link data string. I'll log it to the console just to make sure we got it. And let's not forget to JSON parse it. Then I can grab our link token like this, and I think that should do it. One note I will point out is that using this local storage method, you can only get data from the same domain that you set it from. I mean, makes total sense if you think about it, but that means if your connect page and your OAuth return page are being served from different domains, even different subdomains, this approach won't necessarily work, at least not without some hackery. So back to our sample app, I'm going to need to start the connection process from the beginning to make sure we properly store our link token. So let's go back home and click to connect to our bank. And when this page loads, we're getting back our link token, which we are now saving in our local storage. And you can see that in our JavaScript console here. So now I will click connect my bank and select the Platypus OAuth bank. We'll go through the connection process and we get back to our OAuth return page where nothing's happening. Oh, right. I forgot to actually call my finish OAuth function. Good work there, Todd. Let's add that in. All right. Can I just reload this page? I think I can. Let's do that. And okay. Our function grabbed that link token from local storage, passed it to link along with the current URL, and we got back our public token, which we then can use to complete the whole connection process. And with that, we're redirected back to our index.html page where I can once again grab my list of transactions from the bank. Nice. By the way, one trick for those of you who like to follow along with what we're doing with some console logging, if you were to click on the settings here and click on this preserve log checkbox in Web Tools, it won't clear out your JavaScript log in between page loads. That works both here and then over here on the network tab. And I find that is super useful when you get bounced around between multiple pages like this. So now all that's left to do is add in a couple of cleanup tasks. So first, let's add in a little error checking. If I were to connect to Platypus Bank again, click this Simulate Error button, and then quit the link process, that manifests itself in two ways. First, in my OAuth return page, you'll see that I am encountering an error event in my onEvent handler. But more importantly, instead of onSuccess being called, onExit gets called with an error object. So let me handle this a little better. I'm going to go back to my page here, and let's make this paragraph a div with an ID of user message. And then in our code, let's go into onExit here, and I'll say that, if error isn't null, let's display an error message to the user and ask them to try again. And sure enough, now I at least get a basic if functional error message, so I know to try again. While we're here, I'll be honest, I'm not particularly concerned with this link token sticking around in local storage. They're single use and they expire pretty quickly. But like if you wanted to remove it in your onSuccess or onExit handlers, you certainly could. I don't think there's any harm in doing it. Next, if you want to see what this process looks like on mobile web, you can. After all, that is one of the big reasons we just did all this redirect work. You can either use DevTools device toolbar, which gives you a pretty good approximation, or if you have the iOS simulator or Android emulator installed, I believe both of them have ways to talk to localhost as well. With the iOS simulator, for instance, just open up Safari and point it to localhost 8000. It should be able to talk to your server, and you can test out the OAuth flow that way. Finally, you might be saying, okay, sure, this redirect flow is very nice on mobile, but gee, I kind of prefer the pop-up window on the desktop browser. Could I detect what environment my user is using and switch between the two? And the answer is you could, but you shouldn't. Here's the deal. Right now, while you're in the sandbox environment, Plaid will always use the redirect flow if you supply a redirect URI, and it will always use a pop-up window if you don't. And so if you wanted to test out the different flows for debugging purposes, that's fine. You could add some code to your server to do that. But once you get into production, don't do this. Always include the redirect URI and let Plaid figure it out for you. See, we've been running these OAuth flows for a while now, and we have some very good analytics data around which OAuth flows are more likely to complete successfully in which environments with which operating systems with which versions of which browsers, which means that once you're in production and you have a redirect URI, Plaid will automatically switch between the pop-up flow and the redirect flow based on what is statistically most likely to end with your customer successfully connecting with their bank. You won't need to do anything manually to try and figure this out. So we covered an awful lot today. There's still more we could cover, like using OAuth in native mobile apps, testing against real banks, and using link in update mode. But I'm a little tired of talking, and you're probably a little tired of listening to me, so we'll have to save those topics for future videos. In the meantime, be sure to check out the documentation, start to add those OAuth flows into your app, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can find out when new tutorials become available. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.